The results of the analysis of the Vinland Map's ink in January and February 1985 came as such a shock that it took 2 attempts with a year's work between them to get them published. Even their initial private report to Yale contained a substantial list of further research they were undertaking to check their conclusions. The published report finally appeared in the journal Analytical Chemistry in 1987, declaring that the ink of the Vinland Map contained hardly any of the notorious anaylsis at all, or rather hardly any titanium, as their Pixie analysis identified individual elements, not minerals. The first reaction of Walter McCrone, whose flawed 1973 analysis had originally identified the anaylsis, when questioned by the press, was, "I'm at a loss to explain the 1,000-fold difference between Cahill's results and ours. I would like to think the difference results from an honest error on his part." His second reaction was to revisit his data to prepare a detailed rebuttal, which was published in Analytical Chemistry the following year. Not many people noticed that in 1989 in the Yale University Library Gazette, book dealer Lawrence Witten had published a drastically revised and very informative version of his mendacious part in the Vinland Map story. At this time, nothing short of nuclear science was of any interest. In 1990, Kenneth Toe of the Smithsonian Institution re-entered the war, having attempted the same sort of close analysis of Cahill's report as he had McCrone's back in 1974. He noted that, although the quantities found by Pixie were apparently very small, the titanium was, in every part of the map, concentrated in the ink, unlike other metallic elements such as iron and copper. In addition, he argued that some of the McCrone results he had personally checked in detail could not possibly have been obtained with such small quantities of titanium. Walter McCrone, whose work on the Shroud of Turin had also been called into doubt by the Cahill findings, visited Yale in August 1991 and took new microsamples of the ink, but he kept the results of his analyses private for the time being. With possible authenticity back on the agenda, and the 30th anniversary of the map's 1965 revelation approaching, Dr. Toe's colleague Jacqueline Olin got in touch with her old friend Garmon Harbottle of Brookhaven National Laboratory, and delicate negotiations began to allow a piece of the map to be cut off and incinerated for the purpose of carbon dating at the National Science Foundation's Arizona facility. This was done in February 1995, when a slim triangle from the bottom right-hand corner was removed with a craft knife. Back in 1983, Richard Burley and David Baines Cope of the British Museum had suggested that radiocarbon dating of documents would only be useful if it revealed the presence of artificial carbon-14 in the paper or parchment from nuclear weapons testing, signifying that the document contained chemicals which could not have existed before the mid-20th century. That was exactly what the Arizona team found when they attempted to date the first tiny portion of their Vinland Map sample in May 1995. They managed to remove the mystery chemical, totaling 20 to 30% of the sample mass, with acetone solvent, and estimated that it could not have been applied to the parchment much before 1958. 2 tests of the cleansed parchment in the next few weeks gave results which were consistent with each other and more realistic for a supposedly 15th century parchment. However, in September, the team tested another sample using a different washing procedure and got a slightly but significantly different figure. By this time, the anniversary edition of the official 1965 book about the Vinland Map was already behind schedule, and printing went ahead without any mention of the carbon dating. My personal opinion is that this new edition of the book is a disgrace to academic publishing. Although the main text was not updated, several new essays were added at the beginning, all of which either ignored or actively belittled the evidence of forgery which had been revealed since 1965. Most researchers who had studied the map since 1965, including Norwegian-American historian Kirsten Seaver, who had that spring published a bold new theory about the possible creator of the map, were not invited to contribute or even made aware that a new edition was being printed. Yale asked Wilcombe Washburn, organiser of the 1966 Vinland Map Conference at the Smithsonian Institution, who was a contributor, to head a new symposium at Yale on 10th February 1996. Walter McCrone and Kenneth Toe were at least invited to this, but initially ignored it until they learned that it would mark the launch of a book they had not been told about. They made their positions very clear at the symposium, and when press reports over the next few weeks gave misleading impressions of the state of research, failing to appreciate, for example, that the Cahill Pixie analyses were the same ones they had reported on back in 1987, not new work, Toe wrote letters exposing some of the information which had been kept from the public. One particularly egregious claim in the 1996 book, in an essay by Thomas Cahill with his colleague Bruce Cusco, was that in 1985 they had found large numbers of loose particles in the fold of the map, but did not analyse the particles compositionally at the time, since their provenance was so clouded. In reality, as Toe stated, some of the loose particles had been analysed in 1985 using techniques other than Pixie, and significant quantities of titanium had been found. The analyst in question was Gregory Muller, the scientist who had examined the map at Yale in 1982 when the Pixie analysis was first proposed, and shortly afterwards his unpublished work was used by the Smithsonian Institution in the Vinland Map section of a book about the Viking exploration of the North Atlantic. What Cahill and Cusco did suggest in their 1996 essay, though, was that the McCrone team member responsible for selecting the microsamples might unconsciously have picked particles which were easy to remove, and thus might well have represented contamination, not ink. Oddly enough, that genuinely did happen in one case, as I found several years later in discussions with Kenneth Toe about a mistake in my research. In the original McCrone report to Yale, one sample had been labelled loose black particle, maybe artifact. Evidently Walter McCrone missed that annotation when he revisited his notes for the 1988 rebuttal paper, as he used that particle, sample 9-C-2, as an example of typical black pigment on the map. In reality, rich in iron and chromium, it was utterly unlike the normal black pigment on the map, but very like many of the loose particles taken from the map fold by Gregory Muller. I'll return to this matter in part 6. Having missed their opportunity to play a major part in the anniversary celebrations, the carbon dating team seemed to lose enthusiasm. Although a fresh run in April 1996 produced results agreeing with those of the previous September, they made no attempt to finalise their work for publication. Jacqueline Owen, however, took the opportunity to revive her 1970s theory about the production of anaylsis as a byproduct of the manufacture of green vitriol as an ingredient for iron-based ink, perhaps bolstered by McCrone's iron-rich sample 9-C-2. Walter McCrone himself waited for the anniversary publicity to die away and, in 1999, released the results of his 1991 resampling analyses. Although he had picked the samples himself, they contained just as much anaylsis as the ones selected by his colleague back in 1973. Furthermore, microscope photos revealed anaylsis crystals through the full thickness of the ink. Mrs. Owen, meanwhile, dusted off an essay she had written back in 1993 for inclusion in the 1996 anniversary book, with updates including the statement that the parchment of the map has now been sampled for carbon-14 dating. If a precise date shows that the parchment dates to the mid-15th century, the significance becomes very real. This was published in 2000, 5 full years after the first carbon dating test, with the date range quite firmly established yet still unpublished. Her main theme, however, was a return to her proposal back in the 1960s that more comparative scientific studies of inks were needed. In fact, more comparative studies of inks already were being made in Europe, particularly using the Pixie technique pioneered by Thomas Cahill's team in California 2 decades earlier. Also, another relatively recent non-destructive technique, Raman spectroscopy, was being used very effectively for mineralogical analysis of inks. In 2000, Professor Robin Clark of University College London was working with Yale on a project to equip them with a Raman spectrometer, following a talk he had given there in 1999. The Vinland Map seemed like a good subject for a demonstration of the system's effectiveness, so he arranged with his PhD student Catherine Brown that in November 2000 they would use a spectrometer borrowed from the manufacturer to examine multiple points on the map and its associated documents. Unfortunately, the equipment unexpectedly became unavailable, but eventually in November 2001 they began work at Yale with a transportable version, concentrating on areas which had been studied by the Cahill team. In March 2002, they submitted their report to the journal Analytical Chemistry, which had also published the McCrone and Cahill papers. The online version was published on 25th June, showing that the brown ink did indeed contain significant quantities of anaylsis, and that the black pigment was amorphous carbon, similar to soot. On 10th July 2002, Walter McCrone died, knowing that all analyses of the Vinland Map ink backed him against the Cahill Pixie team. Meanwhile, while Brown and Clark were waiting for a spectrometer, the Arizona carbon dating team decided it was time to make one last measurement, which they did in March 2001. Uncannily, their report was published in the journal Radiocarbon in July 2002. By the end of that month, the press had picked up on these two apparently contradictory reports, and Vinland Map fever reignited. Unsurprisingly, Thomas Cahill was not impressed by Brown and Clark's results, and he told the press that they had made a series of fairly modest measurements and then went into a bunch of speculation that is not supported by numbers. Whereas Kenneth Toe thought that Brown and Clark did a wonderful job of basically confirming early work, establishing that the ink is quite different from any other medieval ink. Robin Clark responded to Cahill with the observation that the measurements, albeit modest, were all that was needed to indicate beyond doubt that nearly pure anaylsis is present in significant, not trace amounts on the lines alone of the map and not elsewhere, and at concentrations far higher than implied by the Pixie measurements. Jacqueline Owen took advantage of the furore to promote yet again her theory that the anaylsis in the Vinland Map ink came from ilmenite used in the production of green vitriol to make iron-based ink, despite the fact that analyses including Cahill's had shown there was almost no iron on the Vinland Map. Her paper in Analytical Chemistry, November 2003, titled Evidence that the Vinland Map is Medieval, was the final straw for many, including Michael Henchman of Brandeis University, Massachusetts, who swiftly wrote a short rebuttal published in Analytical Chemistry in 2004 under the title On the Absence of Evidence that the Vinland Map is Medieval. Henchman observed that Olin's paper, reiterating ideas she had been unable to substantiate in decades of work, had nevertheless generated over 100 news reports around the world, and that new TV documentaries about the controversy would soon be appearing. He despairingly added, "In every case, science is discredited because of the seeming inability of scientists, after 40 years of effort, to solve a scientific problem. Is it any wonder that science, scientific argument and scientists are held in decreasing public esteem?" Robin Clark also wrote a response to Olin titled The Vinland Map, Still a 20th Century Forgery, while Kenneth Toe's was The Vinland Map ink is not medieval, and, after some years of quiet observation, I decided to step into the quagmire myself.